Good evening, everyone. I'm Maryann Schicketanz, and as board member of AIA Monterey Bay, I want to welcome you to Lecture 2 of our Spring Lecture Series. And I first want to thank our host, Don Davis. He is back there. Thank you. And Carmel Realty, I don't know if they're here, but they are responsible for covering our speaker fee tonight. And special thanks to Mark Baer, who volunteered to do videography of all of our lecture series. So they will be available online at the end of the program. So thank you very much. And our committee, it was a lot of work to get all this set up, many hours. Thank you, everybody. They're listed on your flyer here. And with that, I want to introduce you one more time to Pierluigi Serraino and take it from here.
Okay. But anyway, I am really delighted to see so much interest. Thank you, Maryann, for making this happen. And I want to believe that the subject matter is something that all of us have some stake in. Certainly, some notable people have some stake on it. And I'm going to share something that was very meaningful to me. We're going to focus on what has been happening, what happened during the mid-century modern period in this area, but sort of narrowing down some of the ideas that we looked at in the concept that we looked at in the first lecture. For me, one of the motivators of this conversation was really, as I mentioned in the first lecture, was Julius Shulman, whom I met through a very serendipitous encounter at UCLA. I made a comment on the Kaufman House, and I said, I don't know if we really like the picture or if we like the architecture, or if we like both. And that led to 20 years of benevolent obsession about mid-century modern architectural photography, California modernism. So this book that came out in 2006 is something that was a counter, a Northern California response to modernism we discovered, which was particularly successful. We were pleased, but we didn't expect that it was going to be so popular. So it was striking some chords. So in the first occasion when Modernism Rediscovered came out, we went to Europe with Shulman, and we talked, we lectured, and we went to the RIBA. Shulman wanted to visit Norman Foster. So we saw Norman Foster. It was fantastic to see this emperor coming in. And so when this book came out, I sent him this book. And I got this letter. Thank you very much for your book on icons of Northern California modernism. I very much look forward to reading it. Looks very interesting. And the beauty of this is it came the day of my birthday, was for December 4th. And the common denominator between, if there is one between me and Foster, is Ashton and Allen. Because Norman Foster was working in Ashton and Allen in 1960 when Richard Rogers was in Skidmore, Owens and Merrill at the same time. And Rogers was unceremoniously fired by Skidmore. Again, I don't know why, but it did happen. And Foster, that worked on the International Building, then moved on to other enterprises. So I sort of tried to see if this legacy had some resonance in them, which they did. And so with that entry point into Ashton and Allen, I want to show you a few projects that are part of the Monterey Bay, but sort of going back and forth between this California heritage, the Southern California, Northern California, and then focusing more on the local characters. Ashton and Allen was a firm of tremendous impact from its beginning in 1940 till the death of Bob Ashley in 1964. It had an astounding trajectory. In a matter of few years, they were dominating the market with not only with Eichler Homes, they did the Sedona Chapel, a major house in Taxco, Mexico, that sort of brought regionalism to a whole other level of exposure. And they did two houses in Yankee Point, of which This one is the Hammond's house in 1951, which was published and was photographed by several photographers. Ron Partridge, the son of Imogen Cunningham, Maynard Parker photographed it. And the house is still there, but there's a second story on top of this house, which is kind of hard to imagine. I guess part of the reasons why we're having this conversation is because we understand architecture to exist as an art form has to come to terms with its real estate value, its functionality. It has to work for the owners. But the way you intervene into that particular kind of inventory needs to be a little more nuanced. And we don't want to be prescriptive. We want to just make people aware that some of these interventions can be really spectacularly well executed, as we will see in the fourth panel discussion. And some other cases are less so. I don't want to say awful, but just some of them really are. So in this case, when we look at it, it's very hard to find this house. I mean, you have to go driving around Yankee Point, and these screens are gone. But you see that it was part of this kind of environment where you don't know if you're inside the house or outside the house. It's shielded. There is the wind is a component. There are issues of privacy, and this was one way of solving this. The beauty of the house is very much into this particular zone, this cushion, where again you are shielded. You're looking toward the coastline. You're shielded by from the winds. These screens are movable. They create all this shadow work. Is really quite wonderful, and this very powerful assertive stonework, which we will see in a variety of different architectural expressions. The issue of architectural expression is really quite important because it's how things are look and are shaped and are profiled and are proportioned. It sounds like a little non-functional, not practical, but actually it's a whole world on its own. Under mid-century modern, there is a whole universe of possibilities, both in terms of materials, in terms of proportions, in terms of attitudes toward the site. This is a particular kind of attitude. It's the mid-century modern residence is typically one floor, occasionally two floors, very, very, very rarely 3 stories tall. I only know one case of Gropius and Breuer in Pittsburgh, the Frank House, which is kind of a seminal project. Another project still in the same sort of arena in Yankee Point is the Moore House. And the differentiator between the mid-century of the Monterey Bay and the mid-century in California everywhere else is really the relationship with the coastline. I mean, how you come to terms with the commanding nature of both the geometry, the rocky formations, the vegetation, is a theme that will be dealt with in a variety of ways by a number of different architects. So this is a house that was 1955, is still there. And I used to work in National and spend off hours in the archives before it was gone. Now, luckily, the period of National from the beginning till the death of Bob Anshin is at UC Berkeley. It can be looked at, but in earlier days, it was unclear. But you will notice that the house is incredibly efficient. I mean, there's a core, there's a carport in here. It's sort of an outside-in type of design. And everything is about the relationship of the house with the view. So I don't know how practical it is, a sleeping area without bathroom, but you know, it's a different kind of living system. We might need to be reworked at some level. The house is still there, and it is beautiful. These are the challenge of these projects is that I'm acutely aware of the issue of architectural photography, not only as a representation, but also how to access the photographs. So certain buildings that are very famous have particular photographs. At the time when they were published, they were wallpapering the world, and then the archive of the photographer disappears, or the archive of the architect disappears, and you simply cannot reproduce the image. And therefore, the building progressively over time, after generations, gets forgotten. The reason why we see so much of Shulman's images in general, and a little less so about Bay Area architecture, and even the Morley Bay architecture, Morley Bay's photography that was he was based here, is because the archive is not immediately accessible. So the archive of Shulman is perfectly cross-referenced, perfectly taken care of. It's indexed beautifully. You know exactly where everything is. It's easy to make orders, print online, and so therefore the market thrives on that. But you know, this photographer's name was George Kane. I've never heard of George Kane. And the archive is now likely at UC Berkeley, but I know about this through images that I saw in magazines. This house is not listed in any architectural guide. You look at the David Gepper guide, the Northern California architecture, and you don't see it. So this is an example of a casualty. It doesn't mean that the building was never built. It's just we don't know about it. Multiply this for hundreds and hundreds of properties, and then later you find an owner that is interested in this house, and the house looks a little odd, a little not quite exactly the same, the kind of house that you see, and you don't know how to deal with it. And in a way, part of this conversation that we started is precisely to learn how to decode some of these types of architectural designs. So we had discussed in the earlier delivery the relationship between the outdoors. This is the Robinson House by Marcel Breuer in Massachusetts, and the relationship with the outdoors is essentially of a spectacle. You look at nature, it changes through the various cycles of the seasons, the changing character. And so you're being detached from it, but still looking at it is one kind of experience. That's not quite the experience that we have in California. This is a case study house 16, and the sun of Southern California invites the experience of the outdoors in a very different way from the East Coast. It's not that we are, on the East Coast, they are any less interested in the outdoors. It's just objectively cold. So therefore, you're not going to spend too much time outside in off-season. This is not the case in Los Angeles. This house was actually designed by Jerry Lomax, who designed this building. So it's a beautiful thing that we are showing this. And these are images that I recently found out where the archive of Esther McCoy is. So I've been mining this archive. Esther McCoy was the architectural historian of Schindler and the early period, a certain period of Neutra, the consciousness of Southern California is Esther McCoy. And these are pictures from the Bethlehem Steel Pacific. This is case study house 18, a remarkable Parthenon, if you will, with a sense of order. But the pool is here. The pool is the quintessential Southern California, Los Angeles experience, and therefore the architecture responds to that cycle of nature. That is a little different from what we have in Northern California. This is the first house that Jack Kimmer and Warren Callister did in Kentfield in 1947. They were 28 years old, unlicensed architects at their first job. This is their first job. So, and they used an engineer that will train T.Y. Lin, who was a very important, influential structural engineer later. And this house was in the hand of Mrs. Hall for 95 years. I mean, the lady stayed there forever. She wouldn't allow anyone to see it. I was able to see it when she passed on, and the house was for sale for just a very brief amount of time. And it's an extraordinary statement in the way it relates to nature, but there is no body of water. We are in Kentfield in Marin County. The house is very organic. Wood is in great abundance, but the geometry that is invoking is highly organic, but not of the organic that we're used with Frank Lloyd Wright. So the term organic is is a universe on its own. Under organic, we have the work of Wright, we have the work of Hilmer, we have the work of the followers of Wright, some of them very, very close to his idiom, Aaron Green, Frank Langhorst. Others, John Lochner, for example, worked for 6 years for Frank Lloyd Wright, took his own trajectory. Is an organic architect. And Alvar Aalto as well from Finland is an organic architect. So the organic is a relationship with the site and with materials, and also a different attitude toward the industrialized material. The relationship in Northern California with the outside is also of exploring the horizon, but the wind it can be very unforgiving. This is the house of William Corlett. Corlett had a practice with Spackman. They did quite a number of jobs, very highly regarded. The house is still there. I have to say, I saw it recently from the outside. The owner, I think, knows what he or she has, but some changes have been made. Again, in this case, being in the Berkeley Hills, the winds can be sometimes unforgiving. You don't have necessarily that relationship, that deck, and certainly not the pool. This is the Duncan House in San Francisco by Warren Callister. I am showing to you some of the images from the Ezra Stoller archive, on whom I'm doing a book. And there is a whole section of California in the archive of this great architectural photography that was based in New York City that was not photographed by Shulman or Sturtevant, of all the people that were in the area. So again, Warren Callister was a romantic architect. He was romancing Maybeck, but using much thinner proportions. He was adding quite a number of details, but the decks are the elements that I want to focus on. It's like the idea that the hardscape becomes a space on its own, a contemplative, meditative, and again, the idea of the looking toward the scenery of the Bay Area. This house was recently on sale, beautifully maintained, I have to say, and whoever bought it knew who Warren Callister was, because they paid top dollar for this. But at the same time, you will see that there's a level of rigor, there's a level of craftsmanship, of a hierarchy of spaces, which is quite sophisticated. It's important to say that I had the fortune of meeting Warren Callister, and I guess when I realized what was going on in the Shulman archive in the late 90s, I pledged to see as many of these people that were alive as possible. So just to hear from them directly their story. And Warren Callister had never been to Japan, you know, and yet he's one of the most Japanese architects you can ever see in California. He went to Japan in the mid-60s because a client took him on with him. But a lot of the earlier work that has this Japanese feeling, they're essentially his own personal interpretation of that kind of architectural character. Another house in Northern California that is symptomatic of a particular way of dealing with the site is the McIntyre House by Joe Esherick in Hillsborough, 1964. The hardscape and the landscape, the body of water, has a completely different function from Southern California. I mean, it is obvious that you're not going to sunbathe here. It's about occupying the space in a less voyeuristic way, but more meditative way. It's the connection with the landscape that is so powerful in Northern California as opposed to Southern California. It has a different impact, a different presence, a different scale of experience. In Southern California, there's more architecture, there's more structure, there's more detail, there's more hardware, and there's more graphic flamboyance in the architectural expression. And here is a negotiation between the house and the site. And in a way, Sea Ranch is the paradigm of that, because Sea Ranch brought together a desire to go back to the roots of architecture in 1965-66. Going back to elemental form, but using graphic design, which is not something that in the 19th century I had any idea really about, and using a relationship with the site that was conscious of the industrial past, that we don't want that kind of complete reorganization of the site. We want to be part of the site, and nature has already comes with its own architecture. The whole tradition of Northern California modernism is responsive to that kind of message. At least that's what I have seen in the archives of most of the architectural photographers that I've had the chance to look at. I want to say this again, the history of the place is not in the archives of the architects, but is in the archives of the architectural photographers, because the photographers survey the land as part of their job. They do this every single day for 40, 50 years. Not everything that is photographed is published. Not everything that is photographed is seen, but the photographer knows. And the photographer, in a way, is sort of the Cassandra of the whole place, because he or she knows what the hell is going on. It's really, listen, things are going, down the tubes, and everybody's going through the same trajectory. This is this brings up something that Jerry said, which echoed with Jerry Lomax, echoed with a lot of what other people were saying. Jerry said, I was doing my own thing. Well, you do your own thing, the other person is doing his own thing, nobody's really talking to each other, and you can create a culture, but then you don't really also know when things are going in a trajectory that it's clearly not where you want to go. And the photographer at the same time has the bird eye view, because he or she sees what everybody else is doing as part of their job. It's an important component, because there is no architecture book, history book, monograph that does not have a picture. And the book is always a selection of a much larger portfolio of images. So the curatorial aspect that determines the shape of our knowledge of the land. So this is a house that is not particularly known. It's a beautiful piece of architecture, extremely well detailed. If anyone is familiar with the work of Carlo Scarpa in Italy, I mean, you can feel a lot of those same resonances. And you know that it's, in a way, there's an urban component in this. There's a threshold. I also I see a correlation between Worcester's Gregory Farmhouse, this house, and Sea Ranch. There's the idea of the precinct, there's the idea of the village, it's almost a tower, there's a hierarchy of volumes, and it's beautifully staged. And then these spaces, they're always comfortable, there's something inviting into this kind of architecture. Although I have to say, again, we are looking at pictures, we're not looking at the house. Stoller's images don't invite you to be part of the scene. You're stepping back and you have a contemplative approach to the architecture. Julius Shulman wants you to get a drink into that particular living room. So there are all the cues that let you desire and quote unquote salivate to be really one part of that particular experience. The issue of unbuildable sites, it's a classic. Now, what are we going to do? So this is actually a really extraordinary house. It's in Piedmont, in the Bay Area. Campbell and Wong were the architects, a case study of architects of the very last period. It's the Sawyer House, S-A-W-Y-E-R. And the house sits on 4 steel posts, 75 feet tall, and then it just comes out. I mean, there's no site. I mean, you know there's nothing underneath. And the house is being incredibly stable, and it was structurally designed by Erik who was a really important structural engineer. The history of architecture is a history also of structural engineers, and we don't really talk much about them, but they are major protagonists. Now, going back to the Monterey area, there are architects that worked here for an extended period of time, people that were just having the one-off commissions, and they all had to come to terms with the coastline. So the relationship of the house with the view and its skyline is really the theme of all these different experiences. So this is the Atkinson House by Gregory Ames. Gregory Ames was a Los Angeles-based architect. He was never part of the Case Study House program, a very important program for many of you who know, between 45 and 66. but he trained with Richard Neutra. And I believe he also trained with Rudolf Schindler. Anyway, he went on his own and he did these wonderful single-family homes. He had left-leaning tendencies. He was in McCarthy-list. At some point, he didn't have any work. But he had a significant amount of fame during his time. And again, this is the relationship with the coastline. How are you going to experience that? This is a classic windscreen. You don't have the cantilever necessarily, but you are very much part of that experience. So the house speaks to that exterior. And then there are the signature elements of each architect. So this is a very typical Gregory Ames detail of the skylight underneath the fireplace with these very, very thick members. I mean, there are innumerable skylights, but then there's the personality of the architect, there is the site, and there's the patron, the client, that makes each building so unique. And that's the challenge of modern architecture, because the modern architecture seeks the prototype, but the prototype is never site-specific. So the moment you have to bring the prototype into the specific site, things have to change. And they have to change to reflect the personality and the character, both of the site and the program, and the available budget and everything else. So you see gestures that you don't see anywhere else in Gregory Ames' work. All this wood and this the site is not so typical of Gregory Ames' work. And I actually don't know the current condition of the house, but hopefully someone will look at it. I know that in the past I gave a couple of talks here and I brought this name up. Bruce Heiser was a really creative architect that was trained under Bruce Goff, one of the few architects that Frank Lloyd Wright actually respected. And Bruce Heiser was originally from Australia. And I have no idea what happened to him. He was based in San Francisco, he did a number of jobs, and this house was also in Yankee Point, a really odd kind of scenario where the pool goes inside the house. I don't know how much of the pool goes in there. But the idea that somehow you enter in reciprocity with the rock formation through the architectural form is something that clearly has its own cachet. I would have expected some kind of a bench in here, but I don't see any. And so here you see a bit of the plan and this really unique kind of geometry. I need to emphasize something. For many of you who are architects, it's obvious, but it's not so obvious to others. There's no great architecture without a great client. A conflict between architects and the client will create a conflict building, a building that is unresolved. So the history of architecture, of these achievements, is as much a history of relationship, of wonderful, successful relationship between architects and clients. And clients usually challenge the architects for the better. This is the classic of all classics, the Parthenon of the Monterey Bay. I had the privilege of spending a whole afternoon with Mark Mills. I hesitate to use his words, but he was a real genius. I was a real someone that thought different about many different things. Very intense, very difficult to kind of get into his good favor. But it was generous with his creativity, extraordinarily inventive. This is the house known as the Wild Bird. It was the house of Nat Owings, the founder of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Now, you look at publication of the house, and the house is attributed to Nat Owings. That is factually incorrect. This house was designed by Mark Mills. Nat Owings was a power broker. He fought really, really hard for the passing of the California Coastal Act after his house was done. So to make sure that, which it was a good thing, but this house was there first. And this A-frame it was not the first choice of Mark Mills. When I spent this afternoon with him at his compound, which is beautiful in its own, he showed me the plans for the house that he had, and not always flatly rejected it because he wanted the same house that he had designed, that Mark Mills had designed for his own parents, to be on that cliff. And I know that the third lecture will be all on Mark Mills, so we'll have more about this. But Stoller was, Edward Stoller was hired to photograph this building, and he was uncomfortable with the first shooting. It was in San Francisco, so he drove down again to do to reshoot the whole thing again. And this house has innumerable details that show a level of care that is quite uncommon. It's an A-frame that jets out of its site. So it is a cliffhanger, it is cantilevers, but it also is reminiscent of its Wright's origins, but it's not a house by Frank Lloyd Wright. And Mark Mills came from the construction site. He didn't like to be in the drafting room, so he told me he wanted to have his hands dirty. And you know, he did look like a man that used to use his work with his hands. But there's an incredible level of romance in how much care there is in putting all these pebbles in here. And you know, he could have just had complete concrete. And instead, there's so much hierarchy in every of these single elements. I cannot say that this is a standard house. I mean, this is an extraordinary house, and it's a masterpiece. I am aware, the last time I was there, the remodel wasn't as great as it could have been, but you know, you did not hear this from me. So this is all this beautiful concrete work with the beams. This kind of skylight will appear again in a number of Mark Mills houses. And you will notice that these micro shutters, I mean, they're just slivers, and they all open to the coastline. You can see this from Nepenthe. Many of you must have seen it. A really remarkable piece of architecture. Not that big. But again, you know, you have to come to terms with this. There's a sense of the sublime in this, which is undeniable. And Stoller was not a generous photographer. I mean, he would just say 6, 7 shots, and he just went on and on photographing this house. I mean, he was clearly very much happy about that. So this same type of a hierarchy I found in his own compound. So even though grudgingly he did a design that he didn't think it was good for the site, he did put a tremendous amount of effort in designing this particular house. We also in the area have some of the work of Richard Neutra. Neutra, you know, I'm an avid user of Instagram, has a lot of posts on his hashtag, so it's clearly a household name. The houses don't necessarily have the advocates for them to be the way they could be. In Los Angeles, there are great patrons that revere these houses. This one, the Dovey House, is in disrepair. And again, some people buy these houses because they need the site, because they like the view. They don't necessarily care for the house. And I wish those were not the owners that were buying that house, because we're not talking about an infinite number of houses of this particular vintage. So it would be great to have some kind of matchmaking between the particular vintage and what the owner can do to preserve the house. Certainly this is the case of the Connell House, which you must be aware of. The verdict is pending from the city. It's a great house. It can be rescued. You will see in the fourth lecture that you can bring houses from the abyss back to their full glory. And so it's a lesson to learn. There's a lot of undoing that can be done. Not everything is lost. So the same goes for the Connell House, of which there's beautiful, there are beautiful photographs and extensive documentation. John Gamble is another kind of architectural design expression. It's clear that there is more, there's a prevalence of using wood construction as opposed to steel and concrete, although there are examples. This is a case where you flirt with the geometry. This is 1973. John Gamble was a designer. I don't think he was ever licensed, and he did primarily single-family houses. Quite a creative, organic architect. He was featured quite a bit in the San Francisco Chronicle in the Sunday sections. this is a house that Shulman photographed, very highly articulated, lots of stuff going on, not everybody's taste, but it's another kind of iteration of the mid-century modern. It's where at this point some architects are exploring the notion of craftsmanship in a more deliberate way and critical way to the more industrial-based type of architecture. But again, the relationship with the landscape remains, right? It's how you stage that experience. How is it part of your day-to-day? That's really quite important. And you know, the expression of the structure is certainly a theme that has innumerable manifestations in the Monterey Bay as well. A classic William Worcester moment. William Worcester is this architect on whom I have mixed feelings, because recently I saw a house that was really, really, really beautiful. And so it's the architect that never since anything major happens, but there's something that makes you question, maybe something is happening. In this house, there's a lot of stuff happening. This is the house that was done by Worcester for Morley Bay, the architectural photographer that our Maryann helped to expand. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of architecture. And in many respects, I mean, it seems like a very tame house. I mean, there's no acrobatics going on, but the scale, the sequence, the way you arrive at it, the way it's sited, the way it's stretched, the plan, it's really, really beautiful. And it's hard to convey this through photographs, even for an architectural photographer like Morley Bay. The experience of the architecture, it's a complicated affair through photography. Photography is fundamentally an approximation, but as you look at these spaces, you discover a number of details that are worthwhile exploring. And again, the relationship with the coast is important. Henry Hill was another important architect that at some point moved down to the Bay Area. This is his first house in 1951. Henry Hill was British, was a Harvard graduate. He brought to the Bay Area Erik Mendelsohn, the great expressionist architect who designed the Einstein Tower. And he did a few houses in Carmel, in the Monterey Bay. Very, very, very detailed, lots of wood, not a very specific architectural expression, not one formula. Although I have to say, in the Bay Area, he did, by age 40, he had done 200 houses, which is an extraordinary amount. So there was a system of doing things that was very procedural, but at the same time, in this particular case, for his own house, it was a lot more lyrical. And you see that there's no shortage of different materials, different point lights, the relationship with nature. I don't know who he was working with as a landscape architect, although, you know, it seems like every other project was Thomas Church at the time, so I wouldn't be surprised. Henry Hill, again, some of these images I'm borrowing from our friends Rick Janik and Ken Seeley, who have some of the Morley Bay archive. Again, there's no showiness in the architecture of the Monterey Bay. I mean, especially, it's really about creating a stage for the experience of nature. So this type of experience is fairly toned down, fairly accessible, and anybody can buy this house. It doesn't seem to be outside of anyone's reach, and that friendliness is a really important part of this. This is a bit of an odd duck in the inventory of mid-century modern homes. This is this is called the Jackson House, 1962, by Michael Sedelsky. Excellent. It's a name that we never learn how to pronounce. But it is a rare case of concrete house. There are not that many houses in concrete in in California in general, especially because the architectural expression is so Corbusian in nature. Another architect who was very, very prominent, not as much as Le Corbusier, but that was working with this idiom was Claude Parent, Stoller was the mentor of Jean Nouvel. Jean Nouvel is a very, very prominent architect. He did the museum in Abu Dhabi, the Cartier Foundation. And so this is not, I cannot say you're going to find many of these houses in the Monterey Bay or in Los Angeles for that matter. But it is one of those one-offs that you can encounter, but you can date them within a particular period, because this was clearly an extension of the work of Le Corbusier, of the late work of Le Corbusier, when he was already partially in India. And again, the relationship with the outdoors, the outside, the landscape. Plenty of details. I mean, this house, I would love to see it, but there's a tremendous amount of invention. It must be extraordinarily heavy too, because concrete, I mean, I can't imagine the foundations. I mean, you can build a whole high-rise on this. But again, to lighten up the concrete, look at the sliver cut in here, and then all the shadow work that takes place. John Conifer is another character, was more of a designer, builder, a number of projects, very much a local character. It's again inseparable, the house from the outdoors. For some reason in the literature, the construction photos were a lot more popular than the final product, because it was such an odd construction. And I heard this a number of times from the old timers, that the structure, it's beautiful by itself, and when you have to close it, it dies a little bit. I mean, you don't have the same kind of feeling, which I have to say resonates with that, because the house looks closed, but it doesn't quite have the same level of poetic of the previous one. Another character that is really important is Gordon Drake. Gordon Drake was, I would say, was the James Dean of architecture. He died at 34 in a ski accident. It was one of the great promises of California modernism. Originally from Texas, he was stationed in Hawaii, and he did some work for the army there, and then he moved to Los Angeles. And he did about 60 designs. Many of them got him a tremendous amount of notoriety, because he essentially provided an example of how to make the most with the least. He had his own bachelor pad that could be doubled in size with these outdoor spaces. Shulman took many of the images, and I actually learned from him. Gordon Drake influenced the work of Wynkoop, the great Australian architect, by his own admission. Drake, at some point, it must have been a troubled character, because I wrote an intro to a reprint of his monograph, and I had access to his correspondence. There was some kind of inner turbulence. He had a wife, he divorced, he went up to the Monterey Bay, he was trying to found a school, he didn't work out, and then he ended up in the Bay Area, and he did one project, and then he died. And he was probably involved in the construction of the Weston Havens House in 1941, I believe. Howard Hamilton Harris did right behind campus, which is an extraordinary piece of architecture. Harris wrote one of the essays in honor of Gordon Drake, and his landscape architect of choice was Douglas Bayliss, and he's the one who did, who essentially put together the book. And so there are a few examples of Gordon Drake's work. It's all the work is wood, and it's highly articulated with the entry experience, very low cost, but the hardscape is as important as the interior spaces. Virtually all he did was houses, and I believe there are 3 or 4 houses by Gordon Drake in the area. This is one of them, and most of the work has been taken on by Morley Bay. You see again the relationship of the car to the house. The carport is the great theme of the mid-century modern, and together with the single-family house. Another character who is still with us, the designer of great influence through arts and architecture, was Kip Stewart. And this is a house that he did in the early 70s. Kip Stewart didn't really have a design idiom that I'm aware of, because I've seen many different type of houses. But again, this already places the house more into the early 70s, because in the 70s the language became more and more abstract in the early 70s. When you look at the work comparatively, there's a higher level of articulation early on in the houses of the 40s and the 50s. And the architecture progressively becomes more mute. But there is something quite majestic about the double height and the relationship with the outside. So this kind of detail, right away, it's already late 60s. I mean, every time I see a picture like this, I know that I'm in that era, because that kind of siding, you never see that early on. And I don't know how much Barragan, and also there's a period of Philip Johnson when he was painting white bricks. But Kip Stewart has produced a number of buildings. There's not a book on Kip Stewart. I don't know who has the archive, I don't know. Are they still in the family hands still, you think? Yeah. So I've seen images of his work in the archive of Maryann. He doesn't have a key photographer, but this is a classic case. If you find a house by Kip Stewart and there is nothing available, how are you going to know that this house is worthwhile preserving? It's a typical situation. And in closing, you know, we go to the classic of all classics, the Walker House, the ubiquitous Frank Lloyd Wright. I think every region of the United States can claim a Frank Lloyd Wright house. But this was a particularly important house, because it's its own design statement that really engages the coastline in a beautiful, poetic, romantic way. And this is a house that has been photographed by virtually everybody. And again, very, very small, highly articulated. I mean, I'm sure all of you have seen it, but how this element cuts into the coast and really gives its architectural image is really quite extraordinary. And then this sliver of glass that cuts across and makes everything lighter despite all the stonework. So these are the images of Ezra Stoller. And the beauty of this, of the work, is how you see these moves being telegraphed into the inside as well. I mean, there's integrative, coherence in the inside and the outside. Some of the interiors, I didn't have the chance to look at the interior. I was able to get close to it, but we don't have the keys to get inside. Although I know the son of the brother of the owner. When the last time we were here, I was here actually to visit Maryann. I was with Tim Griffith, this wonderful architectural photographer, and Tim went crazy photographing this house, and he took a drone, and I'd never seen a drone image of the Walker House. So you really see the beautiful geometry, how the leanness of the architectural gesture. Thank you. So I am open to questions, challenges.
What's your opinion on non-residential architecture?
That's an excellent question. I focused specifically because I was on residential, because I was given directives to essentially make the delivery more useful for an audience of possible realtors or owners or advocates. But the inventory of the mid-century period is much larger. There are clearly the coffee shops and schools, some city halls, there are churches, there are some great buildings. And I mean, I went to see some of the schools on Mario Ciampi, and I just wanted to scream because they didn't, clearly the facilities people had no idea what they had. So I showed the house of Philip Johnson at the end of the last lecture, and now it was turned into a pitched roof with a fireplace. It's not obvious, might be obvious to this audience, to others. So you got to be very, very deliberate on having an attitude on what to do with that. There are Los Angeles has been very good at creating an economy of this. Palm Springs has been extraordinary about creating an economy. I've seen, I think they're building a gas station by one of the architects. They're building unbuilt work. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. What's
the hospital here has done a spectacular job of
yes. The Earl Stone building? Yes, the Earl Stone is a very controversial architect because, see what's going on with Stanford Hospital. But, he had a big office because of when he opened the Stanford Hospital, and he did a bunch of libraries. One of the libraries in Palo Alto was just bulldozed. There was a nice library after that, but it was perfectly fine. They could have added to the old library. It was a beautiful building. It was not an ordinary library. They could have saved it. So a lot of it is just political will. But we don't have an advocate for Durrell Stone. But Durrell Stone had these two lives, the rationalist period and the more ornate period. Like, we don't have an advocate for the work of Yamasaki, who's a fantastic architect because he's associated with the Twin Towers and the Ego, that was massacred, but the early work was beautiful. I saw stuff in the Stoller archive, which was astonishing. And again, if you don't have certain images that you can latch onto and a narrative, many of these will be casualties of the real estate development process, which is part of the game of architecture. The buildings have to be useful. They have to be, otherwise they are ruins, or they are a folly of someone else that has enough money to keep them alive on a feeding tube. So the reinvention of these buildings is one of the challenges of architects today, and part of it is making the case for the existence of these buildings, of which the Monterey Bay has a significant amount. I know the list that the local community has provided. It's astonishing, and it keeps growing. And I'm sure if someone looked at the Morley Bay archive in depth, they're going to find a lot more things, a lot more gems here and there. Yes?
Does the Morley Bay archive, is it accessible?
It is. It is in boxes, so you have to take them out one at a time. It's a complicated thing. The beauty for this job that I did on the Enzo Stoller, which will be published in October, the ESTO has scanned the entire archive. So they sent me a hard drive with 47,000 images. And I just looked at them one by one, and it was like, it was like a heart attack one after the other. Because no one has ever seen them to their full extent. There are some images for the Rockefellers that had never been made public because the Rockefeller put a veto on them, and a bunch of, a place that is filled with a great architecture is Woodside. Filled. Non-disclosure agreements. You cannot publish it. You cannot photograph it. You cannot do anything. But Woodside is filled with great architecture. Are there questions? Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about what happens after mid-century modern. You've given these two wonderful lectures about the genre.
Yeah.
But it reaches an end. It reaches a dead end.
Yes.
And it happens, it goes to something else.
Yes.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
So there is a confluence of factors that take place. The first is that the masters of modern architecture die in a matter of 3 years. So Le Corbusier in 65, and Gropius and Mies 68, 69. So you don't have the moral armature there. There have been in the 60s a number of initiatives from the Museum of Modern Art that were questioning the paradigm. The first was The Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture by Robert Venturi in 1966, which was an exhibit and a catalog, which the book came out. The other one was Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Budowski. Architecture Without Architects took architecture away from the masters and allowed the vernacular to be part, again, of consideration. So from the golden age, right after the war, where there was a lot of money, a lot of desire to live life to the fullest, the 20 years starts running their course from the single family house. You change the scale to the city. The change of scale is not gracious. That led to the revolt of Jane Jacobs. I mean, Jane Jacobs is the symbol of a malaise that was taking place everywhere in the United States. The change in the urban fabric in the name of some rational planning, you know, the arrival of the freeways, the urban renewal. So it wasn't anymore about your house and your lot. It's about, I'm not seeing Penn Station anymore, what's going on here. So the milestones, the places, the landmarks that were part of the American identity for many were being threatened. And that was the beginning of the end. Then the energy crisis took place. So that led to architecture was a lot more closed off. The code did not allow all these openings, so architecture becomes more rigid, more blocky. 68 was a social unrest. I remember vividly this conversation I had with the widow of Henry Hill. And Henry Hill used to teach in Stanford. Stanford had his architecture school. And she said, after 68, the students did not want to come to class. They just did not want to. So you couldn't teach the basics. So in the absence of the craft, you lose, you know, the knowledge transfer. And so there was a tremendous emphasis on social causes. But if you look at it, the drawings actually become progressively quite crude. It's more axonometric views. People don't know how to draw perspectives anymore. They don't know how to detail things anymore, and become a lot more cartoon-like. So there's a loss of technology. So the old guard still exists, but it's silenced by this progressive crisis. So people like Lautner continue to operate, but they are not as present. And he was it was Gaudi-esque in invention for Rudolph. There was another question there? Okay, I have to wrap up, so sorry. Yes. Thank you.